And all that believed were together and had all things common, and sold their possessions and parted them to all, as every man had need.
Brethren and sisters, this is the reading of the Family Covenant. Whereas we, the subscribers at Shawnee Run in the county of Mercer and state of Kentucky, being members of the community of people commonly called Shakers.
The established order of this ministry include 4 persons, 2 of each sex. We further acknowledge and declare
of our own free wills and voluntary choice, covenant and agree to live together.
The communal experiment of Shakers at Pleasant Hill, Kentucky began with a promise, a covenant. It was an earthly agreement that evolved from a spiritual experience. The year was 1806. The Revolutionary War was a distant memory. And in the new frontier of Kentucky, Indian skirmishes were giving way to the laying out of farms and the building of towns. Men, women, and children were beginning to hunger for religion. Stump preachers came by the dozens, espousing the gospel and offering true salvation. Kentucky was in revival.
James Gass, do you have any...
3 Shaker missionaries from New Lebanon, New York, were among those on hand to reap the fruits of the harvest. With 44 pioneer converts, the United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing had a foothold in Kentucky. As the new Shaker converts of 1806 walked forward to sign the covenant, there was a great mixture of feelings, thoughts, emotions, and questions. Some felt vulnerable. For those with doubt, was there guilt? Could they keep the vow of celibacy? Others, idealistically optimistic, felt cleansed by the teachings of the Eastern Shaker missionaries. A signature and a seal bound the agreement, which delivered their property and possessions over to the good and trust of the group. Elijah Thomas dedicated his 144-acre farm. Others offered cattle, sheep, chickens, or whatever they had. For protection, safety, and for the support of each other, they were now prepared to live and to cohabit as a family, a community. From primitive beginnings, they built log houses, planted crops, and bought additional land that they would aptly call Pleasant Hill. The spot where we live is not quite so even as we could wish, yet it is not mountainous like New Lebanon, reads an 1807 letter from Kentucky to the mother colony. There is no mountain in sight, and the soil is rich and fertile. Under the guidance and experience of the mother colony at New Lebanon, the Pleasant Hill Shakers organized into groups called families with their own dwelling houses, barns, shops, herds, gardens, and crops. As needed, other structures were built. With stone hand-cut from the limestone cliffs overlooking the Kentucky River, and beams and flooring shaped from the great stands of trees, and bricks formed from the clay of the earth, massive buildings rose from the rural landscape. By 1812, Pleasant Hill had 5 families, including gathering orders for new converts. Soon the community felt that its growth required a new, more precise agreement. As individuals grew spiritually and the village expanded, adaptations and revisions were made to their plan. A revision of the covenant took place in 1810 and again in 1814. The believers wanted to eliminate all inequalities in the division of temporal possessions and prepare for the further increase of new members. The modified covenants more clearly define such matters as the principles of faith, the duties and benefits of membership, and the impartial partitioning of land. Now all Pleasant Hill Shaker families would have an equal footing to secure a livelihood. 233 people signed the 1814 agreement, which ushered in decades of great optimism and growth at Pleasant Hill. By 1823, 17 years after the first converts assembled in Shawnee Run, the society boasted of the largest membership in the West, with 295 Shakers in the church and 196 converts in the Young Believers Order, a total of 491 members. In the well-ordered day, Pleasant Hill believers went to their tasks. The Shakers' ability to integrate manual labor with spiritual labor accounts for much of their success. Adopting a philosophy of use, the Shakers argued that each member of the community possessed certain talents or gifts to be used and improved for the mutual benefit of the society. There was no distinction in rank. Therefore, among their several occupations, all labored with their hands from the ministry to the newest convert. No one will live idly on the property or labor of another, said the Shakers. The acceptance of work as a sacred commitment resulted in a well-defined organization of all temporal affairs. The village plan, buildings, tools, and furniture reflected the shared belief that regulation and good order are the strength and support of every institution. Along with agricultural pursuits, the Shakers at Pleasant Hill developed diversified industrial and commercial trades. As early as 1811, Shaker trading deacons could be seen peddling brooms, rugs, tubs and buckets, and straw hats to local Kentucky towns. First flatboats, then steam packet boats bore products downriver to Natchez, New Orleans, and as far west as St. Louis. By the middle of the 1820s, the believers had a well-developed garden seed business. The Shakers were successful by most standards, and yet at times they were disappointed in their own achievements. Obstacles and imperfections emerged on all fronts. All affairs had not developed as envisioned, yet the Shakers continued to adapt. With change came revisions to their ideals of the perfect society. Along with labor, life focused on worship, songs, ritual dances, speaking in tongues, and visions. Work was worship, worship was work, the two intertwined. Songs, writings, all things reflected the commitment and intensity of who vowed to come together in willing and total subservience to the law of Christ. If obeyed, the law promised hope of happiness here and hereafter. In the first half of the 19th century, many new members were added to the register. As prescribed, lest believers are ignorant of the requirements of the gospel, prospective members read the covenant aloud in the presence of two believers. Entire families came to Pleasant Hill. Husband and wife agreed to dissolve their marriage and live as brother and sister, often side by side in the same building, only separated by a wide hallway. Provisions were made for the care and education of their children. These children would decide when of leisure whether to stay or depart into the world. Missionary efforts to relieve the poor and care for the widowed and the fatherless helped the believers gather new members. From the beginning, the believers warned against anything that would cause discord or disunion. One can imagine the growing distress and horror of these peaceable people as they saw their neighbor and the United States divide during the Civil War. True to their promise of charity, the Shakers fed and tended wayfarers. Although the village would survive the conflict, it represented a turning point in America that would test the promise of Pleasant Hill. The Pleasant Hill Ministry in December 1865 wrote, "The blighting effects and demoralizing influence of the late unholy war are yet conspicuously visible in the society's surface, both in and out of Zion.
Come and let us join ourselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten, shall not be forgotten, not be
The words
forgotten."
of Jeremiah would again echo during the second half of the 19th century. Daily Shaker life continued at Pleasant Hill for more than 4 decades after the Civil War. The covenant was not yet forgotten. Journals continued to record new buildings and many arrivals.
In order more
As
fully
founding
to
members
confirm
grew
our
aged,
principles of
new
government,
elders, eldresses, and trustees were appointed. Of the many who came seeking refuge, few stayed. Most would be unable to dissolve former relationships and ties to the world. In 1878, Pleasant Hill claimed 231 souls in the society. Departures accelerated, and a recruitment mission to Sweden was disappointing. As the population declined and grew older, land was sold or mortgaged. As time passed, the lists of the covenant members grew shorter and shorter until only 12 remained. Was it with a sense of failure or sadness? Or was it merely a practical acceptance of reality that these last believers signed their names to officially close the village on September 18, 1910? What would the Shakers have thought if they had heard the call of the auctioneer selling their possessions?
Thank you, sir. $1 bill.
Had the covenant been broken?
Thank you, ma'am.
What would they have felt if they had witnessed people of the world carrying home their labor? In the coming decades, what had been gathered together and built up at Pleasant Hill would be divided and dispersed. Land that belonged to the benefit of all would once again be claimed by private ownership. What had been carefully tended for the glory of God would deteriorate. Consecrated ground would become tenant property. The careful devotion to order would fall to disorder. But the Shakers were not to be forgotten. In the early 1960s, Pleasant Hill began to reemerge, a gathering point for a group of people with a purpose, a concept, a new covenant. Salvation for Pleasant Hill came in the form of historians, educators, philanthropists, and historic preservationists. In 1962, Articles of Incorporation were signed, bringing a new agreement, new trustees, and new promises to Pleasant Hill. To give the public an opportunity to study the historical, architectural, and cultural significance of the community. To restore and preserve the buildings, landscape, records, and artifacts. The Shaker village of Pleasant Hill, Kentucky is a place where from 1806 to 1910, people gathered, built, created, and reflected upon the nature of heaven and earth. Today it is a place of regathering, of rebuilding, of recreation, and new reflection on the Shakers, their works, and their words. At Pleasant Hill, the story continues as a promise, a covenant between the past, the present, and the future.